You're not getting any younger, so
go to a comedy show right now.
Hey you, yes you. Welcome to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast, a podcast for people who want to disrupt their lives for a good reason, to make it count. I'm your host, Jen Glantz, and every week I'll drop a new episode with stories from real people just like you, who woke up one morning and decided to make big changes, starting with small things. We'll cover topics like entrepreneurship, love, failure, and self-care. Hey, you're not getting any younger, so let's make this an adventure. Ready? Today's episode is brought to you by Odd Jobs Newsletter at oddjobsnews.com. Check it out. It is a newsletter that comes out every single week about the oddest jobs you can have that don't fit inside a cubicle. 85% of people are miserable at their jobs. Let's change that. I show you how with inspiration, behind the scenes tips, and even how people make money who do odd things. Check it out, oddjobsnews.com, linking it below. Give it a read. Hey, any youngers, it's me, your host, Jen Glantz. I'm here with a bonus episode of the podcast. I've got a brand new newsletter called Odd Jobs News. You can see it at oddjobsnews.com. And I decided that when I interview people with odd jobs, I'm just going to share those interviews as a short little bonus episode podcast for you. So this week on the newsletter, we're talking about the odd jobs in comedy, the different jobs you could have if you are funny. I break them down in the newsletter, and I also share a real life story and interview with a person who's doing comedy full time. This is a person that is really working hard and hustling, making money in a couple of different ways. We talk about all of that in the interview and more, plus what they think is the oddest part of their job, which, spoiler alert, is absolutely not what you would have guessed they would say. I'm super excited for you to hear this interview. Let me introduce our guest for the show today. Today we have Shaun Eli, who brands himself as the clean comedian. Shaun is one of America's smartest comics. He is not only a writer who has written jokes for Jay Leno and other talk show hosts, but also has done comedy on stages everywhere, from stand-up comedy clubs to corporate events, so many other places, even started the Ivy League of Comedy, which helps produce shows all over the world. You can find out more about Shaun, and I suggest you do because his website is awesome at brainshampagne.com. He's got a whole series on there helping you tell jokes, and he's really super open about how he hustles as a full-time comedian. So check it out, brainshampagne.com, and get ready, get going for today's interview with comedian Shaun. And this week's theme is comedy. So on Monday, I wrote all about the different ways you could make money being funny. And then
There are none.
There are none. I'm a writer, so I get that completely. I get that so completely. But I think the interesting thing about comedy that people don't understand is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have to do a couple of different things to make some income, right? You got to do a couple different hustles, a couple of different things to really make it work.
Well, here's the way I look at it. I'm the writer, I'm the performer, I'm the stage manager, I'm the wardrobe guy, I'm the web designer. I'm usually the graphic designer if there's promotional materials. I'm the bookkeeper. I'm the tax guy. I'm sometimes the sound and lighting guy.
Yep. Yeah, you are all of the above. And I think people don't realize that. I mean, do you even consider what you do odd? Do you consider being in comedy an odd job?
It's an unusual job. I don't think it's odd. It's been a job that's been around for a while.
Yeah. Well, for people who are listening or reading this and they are funny or they have some funny in them, how would you recommend a person get started in this industry? How did you get started?
Don't do it. I don't need the competition.
You heard that from the horse's mouth. Don't do it.
Even though I have an 18-year head start and I still don't want you there. Go away.
I know, but you have that head start. You have that experience. How did you get into this world? And what was that moment where you were like, okay, I want to do comedy?
That's actually two questions, because how I got started in writing and how I got started in performing are two different things.
Yeah.
So I guess I was always funny. I think most people are funny, and then it dissipates over time because people start telling you to shut up. And I think the stand-up comedians are the ones who were too shy to open their mouths, and so nobody ever told them to shut up. So they eventually started being funny out loud after there were teachers telling everybody else to shut up. But I always wrote down what I thought was funny. And when Jay Leno first got the Tonight Show, I would be riding the train in the morning to my day job and reading the newspaper, and I would read a headline and think of something funny. And when I got home and watched the Tonight Show, Jay Leno would be telling a similar joke. So I said, hey, I guess I could write. So I called the show and I pitched myself as a writer and spoke to somebody for a while. And they said, okay, here's our fax number, to give you an idea how long ago that was.
Wow.
And I did that freelance. I would fax jokes, and I'd get into work, and the first thing I would do is sit down at the computer and type out some jokes and fax it to his office. And I got paid when they used the joke, which wasn't that often. And then when I was on a date with somebody years later, she said, you should try stand-up comedy. And I said, I don't really want to be a performer. And she said, well, she had just taken a stand-up comedy class and suggested I do the same thing. And I did, and started performing. And 6 years later, it became my only job.
Wow. What were you doing before all of this?
I was a banker, one of the most exciting professions.
That's so fascinating. So obviously that must have been a different type of shift to give that career up for this, right? I mean, how were you nervous? Were you excited?
Both. I was excited, nervous, and worried about my parents because I knew they wouldn't be happy with the transition. So my father's an accountant. I did what an accountant would do. I laid out a business plan. I said, here's how much my house was paid for. I said, here's how much money I need to live. Here's how much money I have saved. Here's what I'm making and how much more I think I can make in comedy. And in banking, everybody said, well, what are you going to do? What's your plan B? Are you going to come back into banking if it doesn't work out? And I said, I am burning every single bridge on the way out of town so that I can't get back, because if I know there's a safety net, I'm going to rely on it, and I don't want to do that.
Did you realize quickly that to be in comedy, you had to do more than one thing? You couldn't just be a performer. Did you realize, okay, I have to do multiple things? And then what are your multiple things that you do to make money as a comedian?
Well, now I'm no longer writing jokes freelance for late night TV. I did it freelance for 3 talk show hosts, but that's sort of gone away. So most of my money is from writing and performing my own material. I also put together shows with other comedians, and sometimes I'm in those shows, sometimes not. I also occasionally arrange corporate events with other comedians. Like just in the past couple of months, I've gotten 3 inquiries from corporations who want to hire my colleagues. And so I've sort of got fingers in that pie. I've also done some advertising copywriting for people with products or websites where they wanted jokes to introduce new products.
Seems like it's a little bit of everything. I think when people look at a stand-up comedian or they look at a humor writer, they go, oh, okay, it seems like easy. It's just one type of job, but you do a lot of different things. How much of a hustle is this job?
It depending on how good you are and if you have what they want when you start, and also youth, it requires various degrees of hustle. But really, you make your own luck in life. And I look back at a lot of things in my life and I say, I was very fortunate this happened. I was very fortunate that happened. And make it happen. And people say, well, you gave yourself the opportunity to be where it could happen. So even though I don't want to give myself credit for things that I think are random occurrences, the fact is, the more you put yourself out there, the more likely you are to get found.
I have to ask this because this is a common question. Anybody who is wanting to do something creative often gets, and this is something you must be an expert at, how do you deal with the rejection, or how do you deal with people not laughing?
Well, I have to say, those are two different kinds of rejection. If I apply to do a show at a club or a theater, the rejection is silent. They just don't respond. So if I send out 50 emails over the course of a week to say, hey, you should have my comedy show at your venue, and I get 0 responses, I don't feel personally rejected because nobody's looking at me and saying you suck. Right. Whereas if I were an actor and I went into a room and I auditioned and I got 3 words out and they said next, then I would feel rejected. If I were a model and I showed up for an audition for a photo shoot, let's say, and I'm in a room with 50 people, all better looking than I am, and they looked at me and said, "Eh," and pushed me aside, that would be personal rejection. But as somebody applying to be in comedy shows, it's all done on the internet. So you don't personally feel the rejection unless you go through your sent box and say, "Oh, I wrote to all these people and nobody wrote back." But in terms of people not laughing, that is personal rejection. If you tell a joke and nobody laughs, you just move on and you do the next joke. And hopefully you're good enough that it doesn't happen very often.
What would you say is something about your job that people wouldn't know?
I think that a lot of comedians are shy. We're timid. I think most comics aren't that outgoing. But it's interesting that people fall into three categories in the audience. Some people think they believe the illusion that everything we're doing is spontaneous. And that's our job, is to make it look like we just thought of that stuff. Other people think everything is scripted word for word. And even if somebody in the audience says something, that we put that person in the audience to say something, which is completely ridiculous. And the third category is people who understand that, a lot of stuff is scripted and a lot of stuff is made up on the spot.
Yeah. Wow. I always wonder that when a comedian is so good and somebody have an interaction in the audience, I always think, did they pay that person? Will that person be at the 10 p.m. show? I'm always wondering that.
Well, here's the thing. It's called crowd work when you interact with the audience. But if I'm out there, and I do a lot of emceeing of shows where you start with crowd work just to get the conversation going, because it's a weird dynamic, a stand-up comedy show where the audience is basically told, sit there and shut up. You're supposed to laugh, but you're only supposed to respond if you're directly spoken to. So they got to get used to that. But if I ask a question, and if I say to you, "What do you do for a living?" and you say, "I'm a teacher," and I have a funny comment about teachers, you're not the first teacher who's been in the audience. So I've had plenty of time to think of responses for teachers or writers or doctors or lawyers, for the unemployed, for cops and firemen. For most of the common professions, eventually we figure out responses.
What would you say is the oddest part of your job? Something that's strange?
The oddest part of my job? That is a hard question. Answering hard questions from journalists is the oddest part of my job. A lot of my job is publicity, and it's, let's say, search engine optimization, that I want people when they Google comedian to find me and not find me on page 27 that nobody scrolls down to.
Yeah.
So search engine optimizer is the worst part of my job.
That's so odd. I mean, I think that's the last thing you would think a comedian would say, is anything digital marketing, anything SEO or PR. But that's a big part of your job. It's how you get gigs. So it is important to know that. Okay, I have one final hard question for you. I'm going to ask you to fill in the blank. You're not getting any younger, so
go to a comedy show right now.
I love that. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience?
I want to tell them to go to my website, brainchampagne.com. And the part of the sales pitch, here's one thing that is even unusual for me as a comedian. My website has not just videos, but it has 50,000 words worth of jokes. And you as a writer know that 50,000 words is about half a novel's worth of material.
Yeah. Wow. And they can find that just going all throughout your website?
Yep, there's 3 or 4. If you go into writings, there's 3 or 4 different pages that have jokes, comedic essays.
What I loved about your website was there was so many different parts to it. You can watch videos, you can do how to tell a joke. Like there was so much there. So I'm definitely going to link to it and share it with everyone. But yeah, if you're listening to this, go check it out. I'll link it in the show notes below as well. Thank you so much for being on the show and for being in the newsletter. I really appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Oh, one other thing is, comedians, unless you're a very famous level, we're approachable. If you have a question or you want to write to somebody that you've seen at a comedy club, send them an email. We're thrilled to hear from people.
I love hearing that, because I have my favorites that I meet at these local, comedy shows, but then I always you get so nervous to say hello to them even after the show, but you forget they're human.
Well, one of the things we do at a lot of the shows that I put together is we do a Q&A with the audience. So people in the audience can ask us questions, because we find that they're very curious about us, but don't want to approach us after a show.
Hey, you. Thank you for listening to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of pods out there, so thank you for listening to this one. You can find the show notes for this week's episode up on our website, anyyounger.com. Subscribe, rate, and review the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast on iTunes so that other ears around the world can listen too. Oh, and join our secret You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group, where over 1,000 people are talking about how to disrupt their lives, for a good reason, to make it count. Until next week, all my love, Jen Glantz.